right, so today we're going to look at the Tabernacle of David and some other things. Um, the more I study this topic, the bigger it gets, and so I'm feeling a little overwhelmed actually by the enormity of the amount of content and how important this content is, and how it's not really been talked about kind of at all in the Christian community, and specifically not in the end time community. And it was never even something that I had considered before. So when I was trying to figure out, okay, how long is it going to take for this third temple, the rebuilt temple, to be rebuilt? Will it just take a matter of days or weeks or months? And then I started thinking about, well, what is going to actually go into this temple, and is this going to follow a pattern for previous temples that we read about in the Bible? And then once I started looking at the temple thing, I realized that there are so many different iterations of temples: physical temples, spiritual temples, heavenly temples, temples that have been built in the past, and temples that will be built in the future. And which one are we looking at here? And actually, what all has to go into temple worship? And that's when I came across the Tabernacle of David. And actually, that had been something that had been sticking in the back of my mind for like months and months, is what is the Tabernacle of David? But I never actually really pursued it until now. And it's just so big. It's one of the reasons I haven't made a video on this, is because I haven't figured out a good way to break this down into a Bible study, because there are so many threads that go into this study, and they connect in so many interesting ways, and they all converge in the book of Revelation, believe it or not. It's just amazing. So we've already talked about how the ark was separated from the tabernacle of Moses. And the tabernacle of Moses was a place where people worshiped for hundreds of years before Solomon's temple was built. And for decades before Solomon's temple was built, the ark was no longer in the tabernacle of Moses. Okay, so the tabernacle of Moses ended up being constructed at Gibeon, and after it was, the ark was taken from the tabernacle when it was at Shiloh, which was a place where it had been for hundreds of years, and then it was moved from Shiloh to Nob, and then when Saul killed the priests at Nob, it was moved from Nob to Gibeon, and that's where it remained until Solomon went and basically deconstructed the tabernacle, brought its remains into the new temple, and tabernacle worship ceased when Solomon's temple was built. Now, the ark was a different story, and it went on this travel. Okay, the ark is considered the throne of God and also the chariot of God, and God was done with whatever was going on in the tabernacle of Moses at Shiloh, and basically went on a little journey that ended up in a city called Kiriath Jearim. And it was there for a long, long time. When David became king over all of Israel, not just the northern tribes or just the southern tribes, but over all 12 tribes of Israel, he became the king, and he conquered the city of Jebus, which is also known as Jerusalem. Okay, and it became the city of David because it belonged to him. Okay, he owned this stronghold at Jebus. And David built himself a palace there. And while he was in his palace, he wanted to have the ark of God join him. So he set up a tent, and I think it was probably right next door to his house. And in this tent, he desired to place the Ark of the Covenant. What's interesting to me is that God did not lay it on David's heart to put the ark back in the tabernacle of Moses at Gibeon. And what this tells me is that God was beginning to reveal some new information about how to have a relationship with him. The tabernacle of Moses is about our salvation and the necessity for blood sacrifice in order to approach a holy God. Also, the necessity to be a priest if you actually want to enter into the Holy of Holies. So there's a lot of videos and teaching out there about how the tabernacle is a reflection of salvation through Christ and the giving of the Spirit and all of this. So, the Wonders of the Word YouTube channel has some really wonderful things on the Tabernacle of Moses if you want to learn more about that. But I want to really sort of, narrow down my focus to the Tabernacle of David, which is a totally different place. And it's like God is rewriting the rules about who can fellowship in his presence. So the ark is really, it's the visible manifestation of where the presence of God is located. So the ark was something that David wanted to have near him. Now, David was in the habit of going to the tabernacle of Moses. He went there when it was at Nob, and he asked the priests for something to eat, and they gave him the showbread. And this was totally forbidden in the law of Moses, but it was given to David to eat. And when Jesus mentions this in the New Testament, there's no condemnation for the priest giving David and his men the bread or David eating the bread, nothing like that at all. And that's a little odd. David worshiped at the tabernacle, and he offered sacrifices there. We learn about that in other passages in First Chronicles and also, I think, 2 Samuel, that David was in the habit of going to the tabernacle. David was a worshiper. In essence, he was a worshiper, and he loved the presence of God. And that is reflected in a lot of the Psalms that he wrote. Okay, and we'll talk about the Psalms a little later on. So David wanted to bring the ark, the presence of God, to be close to him. So the first time he tried to do this, he followed the poor Philistine example, and he put the ark on a cart. Okay, now I can understand why David would want to do that. It wasn't necessarily to copy what the Philistines had done when they wanted to get rid of the ark and they put it on a cart. I think it was because it's like between 8 and 10 miles between the city, or the location where the ark was, and Jerusalem. And it's just easier and quicker and faster if you put it on a cart and let the oxen, pull it along. So that's what David did. And then when the oxen stumbled, one of the men who was on the cart, Uzzah, put his hand out to steady the ark, and God struck him. Okay, so that sort of put a damper on the celebrations that David was having as he's in the process of bringing the ark into Jerusalem. And so he just stops everything right there, and the ark goes into the house of a guy named Obed-Edom. And David goes home and tries to regroup. How can we figure out how to bring the ark into Jerusalem? David either reads the scriptures or somebody tells him, look, it needs to be carried by the priests. In First Chronicles chapter 15, we read about this bringing of the ark into Jerusalem, starting at verse 25. So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing. And because God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. And David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, as also were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and the singers, and Chenaniah, the leader of the music of the singers. And David wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting to the sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, and made loud music on harps and lyres. Okay, so what we're seeing here is everybody came, and the Lord helped the Levites who were carrying the ark. Okay, because this was going to be quite the journey, a long way, dirt roads, sandals on your feet, carrying something that's gold-plated, which was going to be rather heavy, for 9 or 10 miles into Jerusalem. And so they sacrificed because God had been so good. So I want you to notice what David is wearing. He's wearing a linen robe, as also were the Levites. And he was wearing a linen ephod, which is an article of clothing that's associated with the priests and the Levites. David was not dressed as a king. He was dressed as a priest. So here we have the first indication of a priest king who is worshiping God. And I hope this sort of rings some bells for you about what we see in the book of Revelation with a kingdom of priests, okay, with these priest kings, these kings in Revelation chapters 4 and 5 who are seated on thrones wearing white robes, and yet they are offering up incense. They are worshiping God and giving him praise in the heavenly temple. So we're getting an indication here of the very first example outside of for Melchizedek, okay, in the book of Genesis, which we'll look at later, that David was a priest king, and as he's bringing the ark into his the tabernacle, the tent that's going to be right next door to him on Mount Zion, he is dressed as a priest, as a Levite. In addition to David being dressed as a priest king and he is worshiping, it's really important to understand that singing, music, instruments, that kind of worship was not a part of Mosaic worship. The Mosaic system, the Tabernacle of Moses, was really all about sacrifices. The people would bring sacrifices for their sins, to atone for their sins. They'd bring their first fruits into the tabernacle. But it wasn't about worship, singing, prayer. Okay, that is not the kind of thing that the general populace was involved in. Music was not a part of Mosaic worship. So when David has this inspiration, and I believe it's from the Lord, this is a pattern or a picture of where God is moving. He is moving from a priesthood that's based on the Aaronic priesthood. Remember, David is from the tribe of Judah, and here he is. He's acting as a Levite, as a priest, bringing the ark into the tabernacle that he's erected for it. And by the way, it's just a tent. There is nothing else there. There's no brazen altar. There's no laver. There's no menorah. There's, nothing. There's just an ark, okay, and worship. There are singers. There's many singers that he's assigned to worship. There's instrumentalists. And what David is adding to the whole thing here is heartfelt worship. It's worship from the heart. It's not about sacrifices. And so in the next video, what I want to look at is David's worship. Okay, and this is one of the things that really was like an aha moment for me. There are so many psalms in the book of Psalms that were written by David. Many of them are prophetic of Christ. One of them, Psalm 110, Thou art a king forever after the order of Melchizedek. This was revelation that God gave David about another kind of priesthood. And I believe David was wanting to enter into that priest-king kind of worship. David was a prophet, he was a king, and he was a priest. And these are all three different offices that are in shadow form being placed into David's life, that are going to be the shadow of the greater David to come, who is, of course, the Messiah, our Lord Jesus. But when David talks about the house of God, okay, that he is going into the house of God, that he loves to be in God's presence, he is not talking about Solomon's temple. Solomon hadn't even been born yet. And let's just take a look at some of these Psalms really quickly. Psalm 26:8, O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. He is not talking about a brick and mortar temple here. He's talking about the tent that's next door to him, the place where God's presence dwells, where God's glory is. One thing I have desired of the Lord, and that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. Psalm 27:4. I will abide in your tabernacle forever. I will trust in the shelter of your wings. Psalm 61:4. This is all in reference to the tent which only housed the ark. Okay, there were no sacrifices, no animal sacrifices taking place at this temple. None. Okay, and it is called a temple. It's also called the house of the Lord. It's also called the sanctuary. In Psalm 63, thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands to your name. Psalm 63. Psalm 65:4 says this, How blessed is the one whom you choose and bring near to you to dwell in your courts. We will be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. Okay, there are numerous passages in Psalms that talk about the temple, and it's not Solomon's temple. Okay, it is not a brick and mortar temple. It is the tabernacle of David. All right, so we're going to talk about this and how it's reflected in the church, okay, and how it may actually be the tabernacle of David, a replica of that is set up as the third temple. And what would that entail? It would just mean you need a tent, and you need perhaps an altar of incense, and perhaps the Ark of the Covenant. And we'll look at all of that later on down the road. But I want to consider a passage that talks about the tabernacle of David being restored. And what does that mean? We'll look at that in the next video. Till then, I pray you'll have a very, very blessed day.